Hello and welcome to Comics Corner with me, your host, Connor Nolan. Over the course of the show tonight, you're going to learn all about one of the things I love most in the world, comics. Now sit back, relax, and get ready for the show. Or, well, in this case, the comics. Hello and welcome everybody, and today we got a great story for you. I personally am going to be calling this story Frog Thor. Because we'll talk about that in a little bit. But today we are covering Thor Volume 1, issues 364, 365, and 366. And if you guessed it, Thor means we're covering another Marvel story. So, Marvel is the publisher, obviously. This comes to you from the great year 1986 from the writer Walter Simonson. And another fun fact about this story is that Walter Simonson actually was the writer, the penciler, and the inker for this story. So all of the art in this story is coming straight from the writer. Okay, the main characters in this story. Well, it's a Thor story, so if you haven't guessed it already, Thor is the main character. Thor has the powers of super strength, speed, durability, and longevity. He also wields Mjolnir, his mystical hammer, which grants him dimensional transportation, electric manipulation, flight, and weather manipulation. Alright. We then move on to our next character, which is his, as he quotes it in the story itself, stepbrother, Loki, who is considered the master of manipulation and deceit. He has superhuman strength, speed, durability, and longevity. He can also astral project himself. He can fire energy blasts. He has flight, illusion casting, interdimensional teleportation, shape-shifting, and telepathy. So he's a really, really tough person that you don't want to get on his bad side of. Alright. Another important character in this story is Heimdall, who has superhuman strength, endurance, and longevity. He also has superhuman hearing and vision. He is known as his whole thing is that he can see really, really well. He also has teleportation. And then we get to one of my favorite characters in this entire story, Puddle Gulp. And Puddle Gulp is just a normal frog from New York. It's great. Alright, let's get into the plot. So, we start off in Asgard, and they are looking for someone to take over Odin's throne. And the obvious choice is Thor, right? Thor Odinson, Thor, son of Odin, But, so, they're searching for Thor, and they can't find him. So, everyone is kind of like freaking out, and it's like, where's Thor? A couple of his friends come together and like, oh, last I heard, he was in Midgard, which is what Asgardians call Earth. And they're not wrong. But there's kind of an issue. Thor is on Earth, but Thor is a frog. That's right. Thor is a frog. And, if I was turned into a frog, I'd be pretty freaked out, not gonna lie. But Thor is like, hey, I have some friends. They're called the Avengers. Let me go to Avengers Mansion and see if one of the many geniuses that are part of the Avengers can turn me back into a person and not a frog. So, Frog Thor, which I can't wait to keep saying throughout this entire story, breaks into Avengers Mansion. And with his enhanced frog strength, I guess it would be super frog strength, kicks over a can of sugar and starts writing in the pile of sugar, "Help me, I'm Thor." But before Thor can finish that message, he is interrupted by Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards and Sue Richards, more commonly known as Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, and Jarvis, who is the butler for the Avengers. And Jarvis proceeds to sweep up the sugar and also frog Thor and push him out of a window. Yeah, yeah. I did just say that Frog Thor was swept out of a window. That's great. I can't believe that this became a thing. Um, so Frog Thor decides he's just gonna wait for one of the Avengers to see him outside of Avengers Mansion. But before he does, a rat comes and tries to attack him. So Frog Thor jumps and happens to jump into the street and then starts playing literal Frogger in the street with the mouse. But he ducks and dodges the cars. He fights off the rat with his Frog Thor powers, and then it cuts to this random drunken guy that's walking in an alley and happens to find Tooth Grinder and Tooth Gnasher, who are Thor's goats, rams that pull his chariot through dimensions. I don't. No, yeah, is great. So then he runs away, and then we cut back to Frog Thor, who is in Central Park, and he runs into another frog whose name is Puddlecup, and Puddlecup tells him about this giant war that's going on between the frogs and the rats. And then we cut back to Asgard, where a bunch of kids find the Sword of Surtur, that then disappears, and that part of the story is important, but it's not dealing with what we're talking about. So kind of just put that information to the wayside. So Frog Thor, which I'm just gonna refer to him as Thor from now on because that's getting too long to say, and Puddle Gulp are dipping and dodging around all of these rat attacks, and they come across the king of the frogs, Glugwort, who has been slain in battle, and tells Frog Thor and Puddlegulp that these rats were taking rat poison to the water to poison the frog's water supplies. So they dive in, get to where the other frogs are, and Puddlegulp has to tell Green Song, the daughter of the king, who's now the princess, that her father is dead. As you can imagine, that doesn't go over well with the rest of the frogs, and Bug-Eye tells Puddlegulp that if he was a real frog, he would have died for his king. And so then they get into a little tiff, and then another frog comes in and tells them that they are all doomed, that the rats are going to come and get them. And then Thor comes up with a plan. Thor starts fighting off the rats, and right as he leaps into battle, we switch back to Asgard. And they are about to crown a new king, about to give the king the new scepter, and the only person there that has any sort of claim to the throne is Loki, the stepbrother of Thor and the stepson of Odin, which is bad news because Nobody wants him to be king. So Heimdall comes up with a plan. And then, wouldn't you know, Thor is back in his human form and is there to challenge Loki. But then we switch back to Thor, who is still a frog and is slowly starting to defeat rats, and he went to look at these dragons that they were talking about, which happen to be alligators, who are being controlled by this guy with a pipe, who they are calling, who calls himself the Piper. And then the first issue abruptly ends with Thor as a frog attacking a bunch of alligators. Then we open up in the next issue, which would be 365, and picks up right where the last one left off. Thor is fighting alligators and the Piper in frog form, and he's actually doing a really good job. Like, he ends up stealing the Piper's pipe, and he starts running away, and then gets tripped up by a rat, but like still keeps going. And then he's being hunted by rats, alligators, all of this stuff, and then the other frogs come in and start attacking the rats. And then it's just all-out war between rats and frogs. And then we switch back to Asgard with Loki and Thor. But Loki is thinking something's up, because Loki is the one that turned Thor into a frog. And he knows that Thor is a frog right now. And it's very, very weird that Thor is still here. But it's Thor. He even has Mjolnir. But Loki follows Thor and Heimdall. And then it turns out that Thor then puts Mjolnir down while Loki is there, hidden as a fly. But then we switch back to the rats versus frogs. And then the alligators start coming at the rats, which is always Thor's plan. But then the Piper jumps in and grabs his pipe and scares off Frog Thor. But then we switch back to Asgard, and Loki finds Mjolnir, figures out it's a deception, and picks up Mjolnir. That's when it truly clicks in his mind that it's a deception. And it turns out that Heimdall has someone pretending to be Thor. Then he flies out the window as a fly. But then we switch back to Frog Thor, and the Piper starts using his pipe to lead not only the alligators, but now the rats too. And Puddle Gulp starts freaking out, and everyone... But when the Piper takes the alligators and the rats, they go off into the sunset, and the war is over. But everybody starts freaking out because now the frogs don't have a king. And everyone's like, Thor, be our king. Thor declines the offer, obviously, because he's got to go and deal with his own problems in Asgard. So he starts taking off, and then he finds Tooth Grinder and Tooth Gnasher, and they give him his hammer back. But right as he finds his hammer, the rats come back and start charging him. But Frog Thor will not be stopped, and he's pushing himself, and he's pushing himself. Then he finally lifts Mjolnir into his hand, to little froggy hands, and then he's granted the power of Thor again. And we get this awesome panel of the classic Thor costume, only it's a frog wearing it. Then he jumps on to his chariot, sled, whatever that would be called, and Tooth Grinder and Tooth Gnasher rip off into the alley, almost hitting the drunk guy again. And that's where it stops. But then we pick up with the next issue, and the final issue of this three issue story, and Thor is traveling through dimensions. He's getting back to Asgard, and he's thinking about how he's going to deal with Loki. But Loki is talking with someone in the shadows about how he's going to win the throne. Then we have some other Asgardians that are meeting and talking about what's going to happen if Thor doesn't come back in time. And one of them, Volstagg, decides to go and look at the sword, which, like we said earlier, not super important, but still in there because it's dealing with continuity. But we're not going to worry about that too much. Then it cuts back to the ceremony of Loki and the fake Thor, and they're talking about who is going to become the new ruler of Asgard. And Loki does this great elegant speech, and he's like, oh, I am worthy, and he's like, check it out, and he takes the fake Mjolnir out of fake Thor's hand and starts swinging around, doing all these tricks with it, and throws it off over the head of the audience, and he's standing there, and he's like, and he's thinking in his head the entire time, because of the magic I put into this, it's gonna come flying back to my hand, and people are gonna think, oh, Loki, he's a new king around here. Everybody follow him. And then a hammer starts coming back. But it's the real Mjolnir with the real Thor, who's still a frog. And he comes whipping over top of everybody, and Loki starts freaking out. The next thing you know, you just see this little frog dip in there, grab Loki, and fly off into the distance. And everyone starts freaking out, saying, "Oh, the Thor that's here is a fake. Someone just grabbed Loki, yada yada." But then Heimdall grabs a horse, starts chasing after the two of them, and they are joined by the rest of the Asgardians. Then we cut to a panel of Malekith, who is super bad guy, but they're just in there to set it up for what's coming down the way. So then we cut back to Frog Thor and Loki, and Frog Thor starts whipping some hammers around and starts trying to beat him up, and he's winning for the most part. But then Loki gets off a cheap shot with an energy blast, but then Thor swats it back with his hammer. This entire time, two of them are thinking, oh, what are we going to do? But Loki's like, if I beat this frog, I get to be king of Asgard. But Thor triumphs in the end. Then we switch back to the bit about the sword, but yet again, that's all just for continuity, so it's not really important. And then Thor is hit with this light, and he is returned to his original form. And the two of them are talking, then the rest of the Asgardians come up and like, well, Loki is worthy because he used the hammer. And Thor is like, oh, okay, let's see if he's worthy now, and tosses him the hammer, and he just falls right over because he can't lift it. Because the thing about Mjolnir, which you got to keep in mind, is if you aren't worthy, you can't lift it. Thor reveals that he's himself again, and he's talking about how he's not ready to be king, how Loki should be king, and so he suggests that another one of the Asgardians, Balder, should become king. And that's where the story ends. Don't get me wrong, the story continues, but the three-part story that I'm talking about, the Frog Thor, as I like to call it, ends. Yeah. Alright, now we're going to start talking about some fan receptions. It is considered to be one of Walter Simonson's best Thor stories. You can purchase it. You can purchase physical copies off of Amazon. You can at local comic book stores if they have them. As far as I could tell, it is not carried in a trade by itself. I'm sure that it is in Thor giant collector trades, but this specific three-issue story I could not find in a single trade by itself. If you would prefer a digital copy, you can get it at Marvel Unlimited or Comixology. And now we're gonna move into the part of the show where I rate the story on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm gonna give this story a 7. Now hear me out. It's very well written. Story's great. The art is great. The only bad thing about this entire story is that it is part of the ongoing Thor story from the 1980s and Walter Simonson's run. So it's very heavily built into continuity. And if you weren't reading Thor at this time or know what was going on in Thor at that time, you could be a little lost, and that could trip you up. But overall, it's a really, really, really good story. I suggest you go read it. It's great. I mean, who else can you say was turned into a frog and was also a superhero and was still pretty cool? I mean, don't get me wrong. There was that time that Captain America got turned into a werewolf, but like, he was a werewolf. Thor was a legitimate, actual frog for the majority of the story. So, yeah, it's really good. I kind of wish that it wasn't so deeply built into continuity, but I mean, like, given the time the story was written and came out, it makes sense that it was just in continuity. So yeah, overall, I give it a 7. Thanks so much for listening to Comics Corner with me, Connor Nolan. If you like what you heard today, why don't you tell your friends about it and share it all around? And if you have any suggestions for what comics should be next on the show, leave a comment down below. And remember, comics are king.